Today, I'm gonna break down one of the best soul sample compositions that I've ever made. This one's epic and complex enough that it makes you feel like you could have heard it in an old school blaxploitation film, but it's not so complex that you wouldn't be able to take it and make a beat or a song out of it. So get ready, because this is hands down the most in-depth tutorial on production that I've ever done. Not to mention, you're also gonna learn some really good tips on how to sequence music too. So let's start with the main part of the A section, which is the horn section. So if you've seen my tutorials before, then you know that one of the main things that I put a lot of emphasis on is layering your instruments. So for this sample, I have one instance of session horns playing. Then I layered it with another trumpet from a contact library called Lumina. So even though the horn section is only 2 trumpets, it still sounds big because of the difference in character that each of the trumpets have. And that's definitely something to keep in mind when you're layering instruments for your own samples. Next up, I have an instrument called the glockenspiel. Now for this sample, I'm using the glockenspiel as a way to layer the horns and make it sound more magical. But if you notice, I'm not playing every note. And the reason why I'm doing that is because sometimes when you use an element more sparingly, it actually makes it sound more special. So in the case of this sample, if I had the glock playing all of the same notes as the horns, it just wouldn't have the same effect. And speaking of effects, other than EQ, the only thing that I'm really doing here is I'm running the glockenspiel through a J37. Now next up, I use these really dope sounding electronic keys. And for that, I went with the Lounge Lizard EP4. Now, unlike with the glockenspiel, here I actually am playing the full melody. And the reason for that is because it's really just there to kind of add warmth and to give it that vintage sound in the background rather than to stand out. So basically, it's not taking anything away from the horns, it's actually just adding more depth. Now moving on, we have one of my favorite instruments, not just in this sample, but just in general, which is the piano. Now, as you can see, I didn't really go super crazy with the piano. I kind of just played it to add some chords and also to establish a little bit of a rhythm. And for this piano, I went with Addictive Keys by XLN Audio. Still probably my favorite piano plugin. And now we go from the piano to the choir section. And for this one, I went with the plugin that a lot of you guys probably already know about, which is Omnisphere. And I went with the Gospel Choir O's preset. Now, as for processing, there's a lot of sounds in this sample, so I didn't really want the choir to take up too much space and sound too high fidelity. So what I did was I went with one of my old faithful plugins that I've been using for years, and it's free, which is Vinyl by Isotope. I went with the 1960s setting. I have a little bit of dust going and I have a little bit of wear. And really the effect that that had was it gave me the best of both worlds in that I got the fullness of the choir, but it also wasn't too much in the way. So next up, I wanted to give the sample some impact at the right moments, so I added these orchestral stabs. And once again, as far as the plugin that I use, I didn't really go with anything crazy. I'm just using Nexus. And as far as effects, I'm not really doing anything other than EQ. Moving on, we have some guitar licks. Now, since I don't have my own guitar yet, and the fact that the guitar is one of the most difficult instruments to actually try to emulate and make it sound good with the VST, I ended up repurposing some guitar licks that I used in a previous session. And in order to make it fit this sample, what I did was I used this transpose function here in Logic. Now, if you're using a more up-to-date version of Logic than I am, or if you're using another DAW, you might actually be able to find an easier way to do this by just taking one-shots and dragging them into a sampler. And while we're on that, I'm gonna do something weird, which is I'm gonna make a prediction about you. Now, if I had to guess, I'd say you really like making music. If I had to make another guess, I'd say you really like making music with really dope sounds. In fact, you're probably even more into dope sounds that can help you get a placement from someone who actually gets placements. But here's where it gets weird, because I definitely know that you wouldn't want any of that type of stuff for free. And listen, I'm definitely not in the business of trying to convince people to do things that they don't want to do. All I'm saying is that if you were interested in that for the low price of absolutely none of your money, you could get a hand-picked sample pack of 13 of my favorite sample drops. Not to mention a few that I haven't even put out yet. And did I say that that also comes with a free drum kit? Now, if that was something you'd be interested in, then this would be the point where I'd be like all the other YouTubers and say, hey, check out the link in the description if you want that. But who we kidding? That's not something you would want. I don't even know why I brought it up. Let's get back to the video. Now, as far as effects are concerned, the first one that I went with is Guitar Rig, which is hands down my favorite effects rack still. And then the second effect that's actually doing something to change the sound that I have in here is another instance of vinyl. And now, finally, the last instrument that we have in the A section for the sample is the bass. Pretty simple and self-explanatory on its own. I'm basically just using the bass to add some low end, obviously, and also to add a little bit more rhythm. And for this one, I went with another contact library, which is the Scarby-Rickenbacker bass. So if you think about the A section for the sample like the hook, then the B section would be more like the first half of the verse. And while I do introduce a couple of new instruments into this section, one of the main things that you're gonna notice is I'm pulling back on the instruments that are already there. So remember, before the glockenspiel was really just being used as an accent instrument, but now, because it's by itself and it's the only instrument that's playing the main melody, it's going through the whole thing. Not to mention, I kind of changed the way that I use it in the arrangement, but you'll hear that at the end when I play the full sample. The next instrument that I brought back was the piano. So as you can hear, the piano's still there, it's still present, but I'm not playing it as much as I was playing it in the first section. Now we move on to an instrument that I introduced here in the B section, which is the pizzicato strings. And for that, I went with the string ensemble from the basic contact library. And it's not really doing much of anything on its own, but once you hear the full sample, then you'll get what I'm doing with it. Now, the second instrument that I introduced in this sample is the organ. Now for this organ, I went with the B3 from Arturia. And if you were paying attention, you probably noticed that the sound of the organ changed. And the reason why it changed is because I used the mod wheel in order to automate the modulation for the organ, which if you watched the last tutorial that I put out, then you probably saw how I explained that a lot of church organ players will mess with the rotary speed of the organ in order to change the sound of it as they're playing. So that's what I'm emulating here. And then there is a C section, but I basically just followed all of the same rules that I followed in the B section by making it more sparse, taking out a couple more instruments, and it sounds a little bit more mellow. But instead of just showing you that part, I'm just gonna play you the whole sample now. So if you're a producer and you want to use this sample in one of your beats, it's actually available right now on my new sample pack, Interlude. And if you're a producer and some of the tips and the techniques in this video were a little complex for you right now, and you're trying to find a better place to start so you can get better as a producer, check out this video right here.